Now I want to do a little diversion and use basic authentication to actually show you how Katana authentication middleware works. Because basic authentication is fairly simple to implement, so we can do that here, and it shows the bits and pieces of the Katana authentication framework. So step number one, whenever you want to implement a custom authentication mechanism, then you write a so-called options class. And the options class, think of the options class kind of like a class that holds your configuration. To do that using the Katana framework, you have to derive from a class called authentication options. When you derive from that class, you basically inherit two important properties. One is called the authentication type, and that is basically the name of your authentication method. And if you go back to the architecture module, you'll see that every authentication middleware has a name, and that name can be used to invoke it, for example, at some later point. So it's important to have that to have a name. And the second one is called the authentication mode, and the authentication mode is is more important if you're mixing web UI and web APIs in the same application. So authentication modes can be active or passive, and active means the authentication logic will run on every request, and if it finds the correct credentials, it will set a principal and all these things. Whereas the authentication mode equals passive means it just is available in the pipeline so that you can invoke it if you want, but it doesn't run if you don't invoke it. For web API authentication, you almost always want active authentication, unless you're mixing the APIs with web UIs in the same application. Then you typically want passive, and you only want to invoke that potentially expensive also code only if the web API is actually used. And then everything else are custom options. For example, in our case, the realm would be a custom option that you could implement if you would implement basic authentication. Okay, that's step number one. Step number two is you're writing an authentication handler, and this is the actual class that implements the authentication mechanism. And again, if you think Katana, the way this works is you're deriving from a class called authentication handler of T, and the T is your authentication options. Now the authentication handler is invoked per request, and it has a number of methods that describe the lifetime of this class. So first of all is invoked the initialize method. So in here you can do whatever per request initialization you want to do if you need to do any. Then when the request comes in and you are ready to actually inspect the request and validate the credentials, whatever, the Katana invokes the authenticate core async method, and the outcome of the authenticate core async method could be a so-called authentication ticket, and the ticket again holds a claims identity. On the way back, whenever you need to generate a response like a 401 with the authenticate header and the realm and all these things, they call the apply response challenge async method, where you basically inspect the response, figure out, oh, is it a 401? If yes, maybe I have to do something. If not, I can just do nothing in that callback. And then the last method that gets called is teardown, and here you can basically dispose any resources that you might need to dispose on a per request basis. And the last piece of plumbing basically that you have to provide is the authentication middleware. And again, you're deriving from a class called authentication middleware of T, where again the T is your options. And the only responsibility of that class really is to create the handler. So remember, authentication middleware is instantiated once per application. So the lifetime of a middleware is basically the application lifetime, but the handler has per request lifetime. So basically what the middleware is doing is it creates that handler per incoming request. And then, and that's optional really, you can also build this extension method that you get the typical OWIN pattern, that you basically say something like app.use my authentication method or something like that. But as I said, that's optional, but typically you want to do that to give your your users a more like familiar, programming interface. So actually the way this works is the request comes in, the middleware gets hit, the middleware creates the handler, it runs through the lifecycle events, the handler uses the options to figure out what it's going to do, and then the request passes on, and either you have like an authenticated principal or you do nothing, which means that your users, your request context will not have a principal, meaning for the rest of the pipeline, your user is not authenticated, and we've seen that again in the security architecture module, how that works.